she is doing the Vertretung of Dominik's Lehrstuhl at the moment for theoretical and the history of philosophy, and did her doctoral work at Johns Hopkins, where she wrote a PhD on Spinoza's Metaphysics of Infinity, has published very actively, and sometimes surprisingly. I was really excited about the classical philology paper on gendered nature in Lucretius. I think that's super cool. But she also is putting out not one, but two books. And so one of them, the title is Property, 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 Our Political Categories. The title of the second, Spinoza on Gender and Sexuality. So I'm really excited about today's talk, not only because she took the opportunity of having especially dark times to talk about how we should learn to live inside the dark times. The title of the talk is History of Philosophy in Dark Times, Learning to Live Inside the Problem. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, dear kings and queens and queers and children and everybody else who hasn't found themselves in this address, I am very pleased and happy that Humboldt University Philosophy Department had the trust and in me to give a talk today. I was invited rather spontaneously, and so I agreed to do this rather spontaneously. So I'm presenting to you a little bit of a work in progress in philosophical historiography, so in the theory about the history of philosophy. Can you all hear me okay? Also back there? Okay, wonderful. And then the additional challenge, of course, was that when I was invited, I realized very quickly that I would have to give the talk on the day after the US-American federal election. It was very unclear to me how that would pan out. So I thought I'd pick a title that could respond to the maybe gloomy feeling in the audience, so it doesn't feel completely unhinged. And we will come back to how this is important in historiography. But it seemed to me that it might be inappropriate, at least for me in my work, to just completely ignore the real stakes that are moving us, maybe, with Donald Trump just having been elected, the President of the United States a second time, with higher stakes, with more complicated global situation, etc., etc. So, having been trained and working as a philosopher in the history of philosophy, of course, I asked myself, what am I doing here? What's my purpose in life or in my work, etc., etc. And I do think that I am not alone with this question, and I do think that I'm not alone with this question just this particular day. And because in philosophical historiography, the theory about the history of philosophy, there has been a lot of movement, I would say, in the last 15 years, 20 years maybe. It's been a long time coming, but the discipline seems to be ready, or parts of the discipline at least, seem to be ready to rethink some of their basic orientations. And I want to tell you today a little bit about these recent movements, and then I want to make a suggestion to you as of how to maybe think about philosophical historiography. One second. And I do think that this suggestion can actually also tell us something about how to maybe use the history of philosophy, or how the history of philosophy can maybe be a part of the daily struggle in the multipolar crisis that we inhabit. Maybe that's too optimistic, but there's an extensive Q&A, and I'm happy to have you rip my proposal to shreds in the last 40 minutes of this evening today. But maybe not. Maybe not. Let's see. All right. So I'm going to start. I'm going to start with a broad overview of what I want to do. I'm going to start with a broad overview of what I'm going to do. Then I'm going to, in the first part, then I'm going to present to you like some of the movements and directions that like thinking about the history of philosophy has taken. This is probably not exhaustive, but I thought I'd use the opportunity to acquaint you maybe with like some of these movements. And then in the end, I would like to argue that maybe we can learn something in particular from the early modern period about how to deal with the history of philosophy. So like this is the tripartite structure of this talk. I'm going to give like a little teaser, so to speak. Then I'm going to confuse you a lot. Then I'm going to make a suggestion, and then we can talk. That's the trajectory. If nothing sticks to you from what I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes, I would like you to remember, if there's one thing from the talk that you might want to take away, is that one possible way one possible taxonomy of like how to write histories of philosophies is the following distinction between puzzle solvers and system builders. This might sound familiar. Some people seem to write the history of philosophy as a history of smart people addressing very tough problems, and then you can string them up and say, this person said this about that. A lot of like historical work, and especially analytic history of philosophy, works like this. Like my PhD was a contribution of this sort, right? Like I wrote a PhD about Spinoza on infinity. So the puzzle is, what is infinity? How can we think infinity? Spinoza is one of these people. I wrote like a 300-page thing about it. And you can like find a lot of papers like this, right? Like then you have like Aristotle on gender, and Cavendish on epistemology, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way of like doing this thing. The other more classical version of doing it is to say there were a lot of like really smart people who built like comprehensive systems that were basically trying to like solve all of these puzzles or like have like some kind of response to like all of this stuff. And they stand in like one kind of tradition. And then the standard story that I'm going to return to later on usually goes, there was darkness. Norton describes it like very nicely. Krista Mercer has like quoted it very productively in her presidential address at the APA in 2020. Like the standard story is basically there was darkness in the Middle Ages, and then there was Descartes, and Descartes was a very smart man, and then Descartes begat Spinoza, and Spinoza begat Leibniz, and Leibniz begat Kant, and then the light was born, and now we tell the important story. So that's like the standard model, so to speak, which is of course like continuously questioned by different people. But I'm going to say more about like why this also makes sense. Like that is one of the standard stories. All right. So like the general distinction that I want to suggest to you is, all right, there are some people, like one way of doing this through puzzles, and there's one way of doing this through systems. And if I'm successful today, then I will motivate that we should have a third approach, and that's trouble. That is like a history of philosophy, or like a history of the troublemakers in philosophy. So people that I imagine as troublemakers, for example, are Raymond Gettier, right? Like one paper, 2 pages, stages the problem, doesn't say anything about how to solve it, then 2 generations of puzzle solvers are busy dealing with this thing. So Gettier was a really good, I would say, was a really good troublemaker, like staging the problem in the way in which it can be conceived and unfold its problematicity to his contemporaries. But I think, Gettier is an especially good example because it's so short and succinct. But there are more characters like that. And one of the things that I want to motivate today, or that I want to say today, is that these characters, especially now, like with the state of the history of philosophy that we are in, are of particular value to us. All right. So that's like the overall picture. Okay. Are you still with me? Are you awake? You're listening? Okay. So I already told you a thing about the so-called so-called standard story, or like the standard narrative. I'm taking this term from this talk that I mentioned already by Krista Mercer, the presidential address at the American Philosophical Association conference in 2020, where she, in her address, said now that like she presented this standard story in a very peculiar way, I think, and then tries to give a solution to it. So like the term standard story is from her, and she is not alone in like saying, okay, there's this one standard story which we usually tell, and it's this like Descartes, Spinoza, Leibniz, then maybe a few other people, Kant, and then on, kind of story of how this history worked. She is, for example, joined very productively, I think, by recent work by Peter Park in a book about the exclusion of Asian and African philosophy from the history of philosophy on the one hand, and she's also joined by Catherine König-Pralong in a wonderful book called La Colonie philosophique, which is trying to like address the way in which, especially Arabic philosophy, Arabic language philosophy, did show up in the history of philosophy in the 17th century, until the 17th century, and then afterwards didn't anymore. And one of the questions is, how is that? So Peter Park's observation is that until the 18th century, if you read depictions of like how the history of philosophy started, you will find people saying it started in Egypt, it started in India, it started in Africa, etc., etc. But at some point in the 18th century, that changes. And here then the story becomes, it started in Greece, then the Romans like conserved the Greek heritage, then darkness, then Descartes. All right. So this seems to be, so the standard story thing is, I would think, rather uncontroversial, and they, and one of the important points here is, of course, Immanuel Kant, and how, like, the history, like the institutionalization of a history of philosophy in Europe conceives itself after Immanuel Kant. And oftentimes, this quote from Kant's response to the question of the Prussian Academy plays a large role, and the question was, what is the progress of the history of philosophy, or of philosophy in the 18th century? And Kant is writing a draft and doesn't hand it in, which is peculiar also because like this is an unfinished text. But it does become important in the aftermath, so to speak, with the Kantians, because it's a very long, complicated quote. I marked it for you. And going to read out like a part of it. So this is Kant in his response. A philosophical history of philosophy is itself possible, not historically or empirically, but rationally, i.e. a priori. Non-surprising statement for Immanuel Kant. For although it establishes facts of reason, it does not borrow them from historical narrative, but draws them from the nature of human reason as philosophical archaeology. What have the thinkers among men, of course, been able to reason out concerning the origin, the goal, and the end of things in the world? All right, this is a bit clandestine, maybe. It's a bit mysterious what he's talking about, but it makes sense to see that before Kant, there's no real agreement about like what the history of philosophy is supposed to look like, if philosophy is supposed to have a history at all, or whether there's no history of philosophy possible at all in the first place. Diderot, for example, the famous editor of like the encyclopedia, would tell you that there cannot possibly be a history of philosophy because philosophy is concerned with eternal truths, and as a science is concerned with eternal truths, there can be no history. So Kant seems to like choose like kind of a middle way. So Kant seems to say, yes, the history, like yes, philosophy or metaphysics in particular is given once and for all, but still we can somehow like think about the progress that happened in figuring out the once and for all state. So we can, as it were, like map out the progress of philosophy and tell a progress story. And of course, the Kantians had a clear idea of what this progress story is going to look like. Meaning, in the end, there's Kant. And then the idea in these like kinds of stories, by Trendenburg, for example, is that you have like a lot of different philosophers that say a lot of different things. But we do have a trajectory. We know that the self-reflection of reason and for its critical capacities and the self, what do you say, like the insight in the limited capacities of reason is the progress in philosophy or metaphysics. So as Kantians, we believe this, and then you can tell a progress history, because then you can tell a story about like who belongs to this history and who doesn't. Because the closer we are to Kant, the more we belong to the story, and the further we are away, the less we belong to the story. That's the story that both König Pralong and Peter Park, I think, convincingly unearth, so to speak, as like the institutionalization of the history of philosophy post-Kant. And then, of course, you can disagree whether Kant was the smart guy, or Hegel, or Schelling, or Wittgenstein, or someone else. But the important thing to recognize is that this model of historiography, this model of telling the story about like philosophical progress, originates there. All right. All right. Now this history of philosophy has been, this kind of like telling the history of philosophy has been criticized from like many different sides. And maybe it's important to say that this story can be told, of course, alongside the two ways in which I tried to introduce earlier. It can be told as a system story or as a puzzle story. It can be told as okay, these are all systems. These are all system builders that are closer to our favorite philosopher. That is supposed to be the guideline. Or it can be told as Wittgenstein had a really good solution to these kinds of puzzles, and then we can tell it as the story that follows along there. Okay. Now, this story has come under has started experiencing a lot of critique, and this kind of critique, I would say, has been very productive, and we should, I think, take it on board and take it as an inspiration to think about philosophical historiography more generally. So, of course, critiques of this model, one way of, or one motivation of critiquing this model is that it tends to leave out minoritized philosophers. So one of the, and this is where König Pralong and Peter Park come from, right? They say this kind of story has been used to write non-European, non-white European philosophers out of this history. I think this has we can say this has 2.5 reasons. The one reason is that, which is the most lo-fi reason, so to speak, that many minoritized philosophers, for example, European women, may not necessarily have the training or the time or the interest to write comprehensive books about a certain topic or build these kinds of systems. And where they did, they were often ignored. One of my favorite examples is Margaret Cavendish, which I'm currently teaching a seminar about. Because Margaret Cavendish did this. Margaret Cavendish did, as a woman in the 17th century, build a comprehensive system based on a theory of infinity, but she was completely ignored. And one of the reasons why she was ignored, there's research about this, is because she's a woman. And she wasn't necessarily she was, in one of her books, Philosophical Letters, she was engaging with the philosophers of the time. But if you read what she's saying, and I'm going to maybe show some quotes later, you will see that her style of writing, of course, is also very different. For example, her sentences are endless. They're longer than Kant's sentences. And her examples are not the standard examples. And her... going to wait for this real quick. And then she's also a poet, which makes her, in the eyes of some people, a lesser kind of philosopher. Then she publishes a philosophy on a book on experimental philosophy together with a science fiction novel, which makes her a lesser kind of philosophy. But she would be an example of an ignored, so to speak, system builder. But then of course there are all these other forms that you could choose: letters, novels, poetry, these kinds of things, which were more apt for a woman philosopher, or for a woman to write in the 17th, 18th century. But then once we think about philosophy especially as a system philosophy, this is just not in view anymore. So one of the reasons why this story might systematically blind us or omit from us minoritized philosophers is because the form might be a different one. Right. Another reason is of course blatant racism and sexism. Both Peter Park especially, and other people as well, have written about Christoph Meiners, for example, who prominently told not a history of philosophy, but wrote a history of humanity. And he thought that philosophy and intellectual brilliance was basically the property of the white European West. Was very successful with his writing. And also Moritz Culier, for example, other character, just in his history of philosophy, just blatantly says, I don't believe that women have the same intellectual capacity as men, and so I'm not going to look as closely. All right. So we already have the model, and we have this what do you say, like this formal problem. And then you put on top the general exclusionary zeitgeist, and then you have a very strong suggestion to tell a very particular kind of story. All right. So this is some work that has happened that might inspire us to rethink how we tell the history of philosophy. And now one of the questions is, of course, how deep in this model is this reductionistic approach anchored? Can we tell a history of philosophy of this kind, in which we just choose the good orientation point, and then we get a good story? It's one historiographic question. Or can we tell this story, but we bring a lot of good satellites into the fold, and then we have the good story? Would be another question, another approach. Now, one of the things that Christa Mercer, for example, is doing in some of her work, and it's something that, of course, she's just an example. You may have read some of these texts. Is to I do this a little bit exaggeratedly, but is to tell the inverse story. Oops. Right? To say Aristotle was a racist, Plotin was a racist, Montaigne was a racist, Kant was a racist, etc., etc. Or you can tell it as in the same puzzle version. The puzzle then would be what is the role of women? What is the role of race in the history of philosophy? And then instead of telling the story of here are the cool ways in which this was solved, you tell the other story. You tell the story of here are the bad ways in which this has been solved. I would think this is important work to do in order to attune us and in order to make us sensitive to the ways in which the history of philosophy was, of course, complicit in these developments. But it comes with an important problem, which is that it leaves this direction intact. All right? So it still says Descartes beget Spinoza, Spinoza beget Leibniz, Leibniz beget Kant, then the light was shining, everything was fine. Just in the other way. Darkness, 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 darkness. So that doesn't really change like this concentration, so to speak, onto these figures. So it's just the inverse story. So you could think that telling the inverse story is basically just telling the same story. So I think Krista Mercer's approach might not be the most convincing, to me at least. The other very prominent way of addressing this is what we might call the new narratives approach, where we say these are the important puzzles, or these are the important systems, and now we say something like we bring in philosophers that have not so far been considered in this story. Like one very prominent example, I think, is Ruth Hagengruber's work on Émilie de Châtelet, French philosopher, early 18th century, who translated Newton to French and wrote a marvelous book about the metaphysical, or like she was trying to prop up in a metaphysical way Newton's physics through the principle of sufficient reason. And Ruth Hagengruber shows how, let's go back to Kant, how Émilie de Châtelet had a direct and very influential role in Kant's thinking of the sciences and regarding the principle of sufficient reason. This is one example, but there are many examples like this of like important where we say like, oh, we did actually have important women in the history of philosophy. Another important example, like a classic example, of course, is Elizabeth of Bohemia. Elizabeth of Bohemia had a letter exchange with Descartes, and is the first person that we know of who directly criticized, and in a marvelous way, criticized the mind-body distinction of Descartes. And then there's a complicated story about the history of these letters, but I'm not gonna bore you with that. So like that would be like a puzzle version of this approach. Yeah. So we have the puzzle. The puzzle is the important puzzle. The puzzle is the mind-body problem. How do mind and body relate to each other? And now we say, can't we find other characters that also play a role in this game? And we say, yes, we have Elizabeth. But we have the same. You see that we replicate the same problem, right? So I'm not saying this is wasted time and don't read these stories and etc., etc. I'm just saying that the general problem of this way of like writing this history persists, even if we try to like add other authors, even if we try to add other approaches, other solutions, etc., etc. Okay. So we have the inverse story, we have new narratives. Then one approach that I also wanted to share with you, which has been quite prominent in the last few years, was Hannes Sauer's approach, who said basically, and this is my rendition, basically this point here should be science. And we should only consider those contributions in the history of philosophy which accord with contemporary scientific developments. And the rest is like artifacts. Like they're like nice, fluffy things in the past, people can look at them, but they have no philosophical relevance. There was a lot of critique of this paper, like very productive, I think, conversation and very productive way of like engagement, because of this like very bold suggestion, right? Like, because the suggestion is basically, let's abolish the history of philosophy. Let's just like write the history of philosophy as an extension of the history of science. And my impression is sometimes bold moves can be the most productive ones. So the approach has been criticized from many directions. One direction is that he doesn't say what he means by history of philosophy. Like, when does the history of philosophy start? Does it start yesterday? Does it start last week? Does it start in the 19th century? What counts? Like, when should we make the cut? Should we forget immediately everything that like was disproven like 2 weeks ago? And you do get a bit of a limit problem here, as you probably can easily see, because inevitably the cut that you make is probably going to be quite arbitrary. But in the scope of the argument that I'm trying to make here, it should be obvious, and I already made the argument basically in like graphically. It should be obvious that it also just like replicates the same kind of story. Like, it also says like, okay, like we know what the good and interesting thing is, and we will only bring into the fold the kind of stuff that interests us, like in that direction. I mean, there is, to my knowledge, nobody who has like completely followed through on this proposal and like would have like written this kind of history. But it is, I find it likely that it would like replicate the same problem of like exclusions and become itself like a vehicle, so to speak, of these exclusions. Okay, are you still awake? All right. So now we have seen the standard story. We have seen a few approaches to the standard story. And maybe we have seen how like these approaches to the standard story are not super convincing. I hope that you're not super convinced by any of these things. But, you know, if you want to like, defend any of this later, please do. It's now, how much more time do I have? Like 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Okay. All right. So, if it is true that like this is a, maybe, I am troubled by this fact, because on the one hand, of course, this standard story is not just an arbitrary story. It is a story that has been institutionalized, and in that way in which it has been institutionalized and taught, maybe to all of you, or at least to some of you, certainly to me, it is also real. Like, it's not just some thing that like somebody made up. So it's not, so you can't really completely dispense with the standard story. So the question is a bit, what do we do with the standard story? How do we, and this is like the historiographic, I think, real problem. And by real, I mean it's pertinent. On the one hand, we have the story, we know that it has been used and is continuously being used to sideline certain authors and models that we might want to have in our history. On the other hand, we also have to cater to the story in order to make the developments of the last 200 years comprehensible at all. So we're like a little bit between a rock and a hard place. And the question is, and my impression is that like all of the approaches that I have, that none of the approaches that I have presented to you is addressing that sufficiently. that there's a tension in this story, so to speak. Enter the troublemakers. So if it is somehow plausible that there is a real problem with this story, which on the one hand is the story that we should talk about and that we should learn, and on the other hand is a story that we might want to distance ourselves from and is blinding us towards interesting contributions, interesting characters, and resources for contemporary problems, resources for an understanding, for a proper understanding of philosophy. So, like, if we can agree that, like, there's a troubling double direction in the writing of the history of philosophy, then maybe we can look at people who are successful in dealing with philosophical trouble. And that's my idea. So maybe we don't have to find, for the time being, maybe we don't have to find one solution for this, like, multi-directional problem, but maybe we can look to authors who make it a philosophical skill to stay with the trouble, in order to see how we can deal with a troubling philosophical history without just giving it a haircut that we like. And I think, for example, that and I'm going to get only to one, but I think the early modern period has interesting contributions in this direction, because the early modern period, like our period, is undergoing massive media theoretical, political, and philosophical revolutions, and there are authors who are really trying to acknowledge the depth of these transformations without downplaying them or without, like, reducing them. And I think one of them I'm going to show you is Michel de Montaigne, who's often called a skeptic, but I'm not so sure. I don't necessarily agree with, like, the skeptical reputation that he has. So Michel de Montaigne says things like this: the most general style followed by nature is variety, even more in minds than in bodies. In the whole world there have never been two identical opinions. The most universal characteristic is diversity. So he will go as far as to say, I think one thing today and I think one thing tomorrow. But interestingly, that does not stop him from writing philosophy, and even of writing a meta-theory about his own writing of philosophy. There's another wonderful quote. So he even says, like, in spite of this fact that I have this opinion today and that opinion tomorrow, he says, reason alone should guide us in our inclinations. So he doesn't let go of the insistence on reason. I'm a real fan of this quote from On Experience. Men do not recognize the natural infirmity of the mind. It does nothing but ferret and search, and is all the time turning, contriving, and entangling itself in its own work, like a silkworm, and there it suffocates a mouse in a pitch. It thinks it observes afar off some gleam of light and imaginary truth, but while it is running towards it, so many difficulties cross its path, so many obstacles, and so many new quests that it is driven astray and bewildered. All right. So here the idea is not there is no truth. The idea is not reason is null. The idea is not we cannot know anything. The idea is and here he's quoting Aristotle. The idea is that that the desire to know is the most natural desire, and we want to know, and we will move towards knowing, and we will make models, and they will probably be insufficient, and that's okay. That shouldn't stop us from making these interventions, and from telling these stories. And it's interesting with Montaigne, if you remember, he invents the genre of the essay, and an essay obviously is a try, right? Is a tryout, is a test drive, if you will. And the essays, of course, I mean, he says in the beginning, I'm only writing this for myself, but obviously he's not writing this for himself. Obviously, he's writing this for a large audience, and the book becomes incredibly important, and really like changes the way in which like early modern people write about theory, but about many other things as well. So although this he does think that we have problems reaching anything really true, he still does think that we should stay with the trouble, that we should write these histories, that we should write down our concrete thoughts about concrete things and problems and systems, etc., and share them with each other. So my impression is that Montaigne's solution, if you will, is not to say we need to cut it here and there, but this is that, I mean, he's not writing a history of philosophy, but I'll get there in a second. It's not to say this is the history, or like this is the story, or this is the theory, but to say I'm going to share what I can share, and I'm going to direct it to the contested issues of now, of the present. And my impression is this is something that we can that this may be interesting, also for the historiography, for philosophical historiography, because it seems to me that we write about the history of philosophy because we're interested in today. We're interested in contemporary problems in philosophy. We're interested in contemporary problems in the world. We speak to the living and not to the dead. I would think like we don't normally write historical texts about philosophy for people who are dead. We write them for the living. And so we do already have this trajectory, but it's now. Because the addressee, as it were, of our attempts to make sense of the history of philosophy is now. So my suggestion in the end, and then I'll be finished. My suggestion is maybe we can learn a thing or two from like some of these troubling early modern authors in particular. I would have loved to like talk a little bit about Margaret Cavendish also, because she has a similar approach. In a way that like that takes the problems serious, like the philosophical problems with the historiography serious, and if I may add this, keeps in mind also the particular material conditions of the different periods. So you could think that like not every period, not every author, not every problem needs the same historical treatment. You could think that in a certain period, like I was informed the other day, like in the medieval period, we have a lot of scripts, we have a lot of handwritten material, but we have barely people who can read it. So here, the material itself basically demands that we write a very, very classic kind of like history. We sit down and read this stuff and like tie these things together. But if we look at the history of, for example, women in philosophy or people of color in European philosophy, the material is very sparse. So we might have to be more inventive. We might have to look elsewhere. We might have to piece it together from sources that don't necessarily strike us as philosophical sources from the beginning. All right? So like the different, so these are just two examples, of course. So like the different material conditions of like different stories might require us to write different histories. They might add up. They might not add up. But as I said, my suggestion is that maybe we should keep the light of truth in view, stay with the trouble, and be okay with failing and telling what do you say, like insufficient histories, as a way to reach out to our contemporaries and keep the ball rolling. Thank you.